not for the likes of
sounds good.
Yeah. Right. Well, but before this conversation gets any spicier, I think I will. I will begin it, if I may. So, could I offer a very warm welcome to all the webinar, which is entitled "Countering Extremism in the Age of Pandemic: Why We Mustn't Take Our Eye Off the Ball." Can I say how delighted we are to be joined by His Excellency the Ambassador of the UAE to the United Kingdom, His Excellency Mansour Abu. So thank you very much for joining us, and you'll be saying a word at the end. But before I introduce our guests, could I just run through a bit of the logistics? Each of our panelists will speak for anything up to about 10 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session. If you'd be good enough to put your Q&As in the chat, I think many people will be quite familiar with Zoom now. You'll know where the chat is on the More button on your panel. So if you would put your questions in then we can have them at the end of the sessions of each of after everyone has spoken. So do keep those questions coming. In the meantime, can I introduce and kick off? We're delighted to welcome His Excellency Minister Omar Saif Ghobash from the UAE. Minister Ghobash is well known, I think, to members of the Society, a distinguished background, not only in ministry and diplomacy, but also as an author, particularly well known for his book Letters to a Young Muslim, which is particularly pertinent for us today as it described growing up as a young Muslim in the contemporary world with many of the threats and challenges that are out there. And the book received great plaudits, and not least with Minister Ghobash's personal story and encounters with terrorism in the past as a particular view and awareness of the issues affecting us all. And Minister, we're very pleased to welcome you today. Our second speaker will be Sir John Jenkins, who needs very little introduction, I suspect, to many members of the audience today. A very distinguished Arabist, ambassador in a variety of places, from Consul-General in Jerusalem to Syria, to Libya and to Saudi Arabia, but also heavily involved in the issues of countering extremism, and the author of the paper on the Muslim Brotherhood, the policy review and the Muslim Brotherhood instituted by David Cameron's government. Sir John is well known in these circles and has a forensic attitude to the issues which are raised by modern extremism. And our third speaker is a great friend of mine from Parliament, Lord Walney, known to many of us as John Woodcock, who worked exceptionally hard in Parliament and had personal experience of dealing with extremism in the United Kingdom as he piloted his way through the Labour Party's difficulties of the recent past. John is now the United Kingdom's government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. And we're very pleased to welcome you, I think, to your first time to the Emirates Society, John. So thank you very much for joining us. I think the background to this is perfectly clear. We've found throughout history that those who mean to disrupt us, extremists of all sorts, will use any opportunity and take any opportunity in order to do so. And the recent pandemic plainly is no exception to that. Accordingly, as the world thinks about the influences of the pandemic and how to counter it, other threats are all around us and may, of course, be increased. And that I think we know from continuing to follow the news. So how difficult is it out there? What advantage is being taken at the moment? Why is it necessary for us to be constantly on guard? What is happening at the moment and how best can be advised? So we have three excellent distinguished speakers who will look at it from their own context and be able to bring us absolutely up to date. So may I invite His Excellency Minister Omar Ghobash to give us an introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair. It's really great to be back with you all again. And it's great to see John Jenkins. It's been some time. I hope you guys are all doing well. On this subject, we've really not spent too much time in the office for the last year, and so it's been interesting to observe the world. The way we've approached the issue of terrorism has been that obviously we fight it wherever we can. But what we recognized in the Emirates was that there was a very, very powerful narrative within our own Islamic community that was pulling kids into war zones and into acts of violence. This recognition took place quite some time ago. Around the 1990s was already a time when we knew about it. And then after September 11th, this kind of became much clearer to us. I think what we've tried to do over the last 2 decades is to focus in on what young people in particular, what aspirations they have, and how we as a government can provide them with the means to actually achieve those aspirations. And when I was growing up in the Emirates in 1970s, 1980s, the future was quite bleak, even though we were a very wealthy society. There wasn't a tremendous amount for us to think about or to do, and it was quite easy to fall into the charm of extremist thinking. We also had, all the different wars going on. We had the situation in Afghanistan, which was pulling a lot of people into it, including one of my distant cousins, who then actually lost his life in Afghanistan as a mujahid. And then there was the other situation of the revolution in Iran. Of course, that kind of polarized the Islamic community into 2 different groups. And we all became very, very aware of being either Sunni or Shia. And I'm pleased to say that at least in the Emirates, that is now not really an issue at all. But the Emirates has continued, I think, especially over the last few years, to develop a kind of a sensitivity to what young people actually want to do, what they can do. And we've created a number of opportunities with the economy in the Emirates is actually much richer, much deeper, much broader than it is in say other countries. The approach of the leadership is not to hand out sort of goodies to different groups, but it's rather to invest in the intellectual infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and to provide uplifting visions of where the country can go. And so on that note, I think it's really important that we marked the successful launch of our probe to Mars, which the idea of that was not to reinvent the wheel or try to prove that we are a nation of brilliant scientists, but that we could put together a team in cooperation with others around the world and put together a probe that would contribute perhaps to understanding global problems and solving those global problems. I think that is something for the Arab world, for the Muslim world, is an important example of how we could approach the world rather than trying to be exclusive as Muslims and exclusive as Arabs, to say that actually we have partnerships with people all over the world, no matter what religion or culture, and that we can work together to improve the lot of mankind as opposed to just our own kind of neighborhood. I think, if that's okay, Alistair, I'll leave it at that and look forward to the questions if possible.
Okay, Your Excellency, thank you very much indeed. That is opening from your perspective of the UAE and how you're seeking to counter it. So, John, your sense of where we are at the moment and what risks are out there, particularly in an age where we have been affected by another existential threat.
Yeah, thanks, Sir. I mean, the billing is extremism in an age of COVID. I mean, I tend to think it's extremism in an age of insanity, quite honestly. And I think one of the, I mean, we don't know how we're going to how collectively we're going to come out of this pandemic. There will be changes. How significant they'll be, I think nobody knows. I think for me, the danger is that it distracts our attention from these sort of issues and weakens the ability of governments and societies to to deal with them and to address them honestly and intelligently. If you look, and a lot of the discourse at the moment in this extremism space is about the balance between what people have regarded as a traditional threat from Islamist extremism, violent Islamist extremism, versus so-called far-right white supremacist extremism. And I think that was something that was crystallized for a lot of people by the events in Washington in January, the so-called invasion of the Capitol and so forth. And I think people are still trying to work out what this means. And you see this in the way that police officers, security officials, and so forth will talk about the threat now. And a lot of people will say, the real growing threat is right-wing white supremacist extremism. I am highly skeptical of that. I mean, if you look at the figures, it still represents a very small proportion of the total number of cases being dealt with by police and security authorities, certainly in this country, in Europe. I think the United States is slightly different, but that's not so much because white supremacism is a bigger threat there, but because Islamist extremism has tended to pose a less immediate threat to the homeland. If you look around the world, what's happened to organizations like Al-Qaeda and Daesh, they've certainly been weakened. We've seen a degrading of the capacity of both movements to exercise some sort of central control. For Al-Qaeda, this is partly because of the contest that they have had with the Islamic State, but also because of the actions that state authorities in the region and outside it have taken to combat them. I mean, there were reports that Ayman al-Zawahiri may not be with us anymore, which would be a great loss. Not. His long-standing deputy, Saif al-Adil, is in Iran, where one of his colleagues, of course, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, was recently assassinated, which I'd thought would be an embarrassment to the authorities in Tehran, but they seem to not be embarrassed by it at all. And in northern Syria, where they have traditionally been strong, they have been in the form of Haras ad-Din. They have been outflanked by Tahrir al-Sham under Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, who recently, for those people who are watching public broadcasting in the United States, had an interview dressed in a suit with an American journalist, which is an extraordinary thing to do. So they have actually been central control has been degraded. So I think the immediate threat to the far abroad, which is all the thing that concerned Western governments, has gone down. That's not been because of COVID, it's been because of action against them and because of their own internal disputes. But they still exist. The Islamic State have been conducting operations in Iraq. Only yesterday they conducted a vehicle-borne attack in Anbar. There was a major attack in Baghdad a couple of weeks ago. So they retain capability. Their horizons have become more limited, but they're still there. And I think more generally, and it's a point that Omar was talking about what governments do to create the opportunities, the social opportunities for people to not simply to discourage them from taking this sort of path, but to give them some sort of perspective for the future. And I think that's globally, the appeal of the ideology remains strong for various complex reasons with certain people. I mean, it's a relatively small number of people globally, but in terms of what you can do with the numbers, it remains significant. And I think that's something that governments need to continue to focus on, because it has not gone away. The second thing is also a point that draws on something that Omar said about the Iranian Revolution in 79. Major threats to the Middle East, what I call the Great Levant, is the spread of militias, of Islamist militias who have a degree of loyalty not to Iran, but to the supreme leader. They're Khomeinist militias, basically. They are, which is what Hezbollah means. They are Khat al-Imam. They follow the line of the Imam. And I think we see this with Hezbollah in Lebanon. We see it in Syria. We see it extraordinarily in Iraq. Only 10 days or so ago, there was a major rocket attack on the airbase on the airport at Erbil, carried out probably by two of these militias, Kataib Saida Shuhada and Kataib Hezbollah, both of whom are essentially controlled by the IRGC. And this hollowing out of state capacity in large parts of the Middle East in favor of these predatory militias, I think, is a major long-term threat. Militias form part of a networked structure that preys on the resources of states, prevents them becoming proper states, and links them into global criminality. And I think one of the things we're looking ahead for the next 25 years is this nexus between ideologically inspired, violent ideologically inspired actors and global criminals. And we see it with the links between Hezbollah and other and the IRGC, indeed into South America, into West Africa, Australia, and so forth. And that's a major challenge. So the key for government is not to lose focus in all of this. And I'll shut up there because I think I've said enough.
In my experience, you've never quite said enough, JJ, and there's always more to come. But thank you very much for that. It sparks one or two questions, and I'll come back with one or two at the end, as well as those from our guests. Our third speaker, who has a particular UK-based role because of his experience and interests, is former Member of Parliament, member of the House of Commons, John Woodcock, but a current parliamentarian as Lord Walney. John, what do you make of where we are in this difficult period and where extremism has gone, not only abroad, but obviously particularly domestically, where it's always lurking under the surface? What do you make of it?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Thanks for that introduction. It's really good to see you again. And I mean, you were pretty much universally one of the absolute most respected ministers from my former colleagues in the Labour Party right across you. And so I was really pleased when I saw you having left the Commons, taking up this role for the Emirates Society. It's a great appointment for them. And thank you for having me on. It is something of a challenge to follow Sir John, given his preeminence in the subject, but on this particular focus of the domestic the domestic element and how COVID is likely to affect this and where it's to go from here. I mean, I think it's important to state that you can both. It's very easy both to understate and overstate the importance, I think, of potentially of the pandemic to the ongoing threat of extremism. Because on the one hand, you've had a political media narrative, well, the focus of the country being on a relatively narrow set of how do we get the recovery, how do we get vaccines back, to the detriment of sometimes looking at the issues of extremism. On the other hand, there can be a blanket assumption that everyone is at home online, and therefore the problems of extremism are therefore bound to get worse, and that is clearly a credible issue, and it's one that it's really important for us to continue to explore. But it shouldn't preclude the idea that actually, in a number of key ways, some of the organisations have had it more difficult to extremist organisations have had it more difficult to recruit, and I've had it focus, and I've had some of the same issues of logistical issues from being stuck inside that everyone else has. but just a few comments on two separate issues that the pandemic throws up. One on the physical geographical element, and second on the narratives and information space and the great potential for disinformation. I mean, on the physical element, Sir John was talking about how Daesh is weaker than it was, largely thanks to the efforts that the coalition of nations against it has put in place. That is clearly true, but I thought it was notable what the UN had pointed out, that actually the comparative restrictions on nation states and their agencies put in place by COVID, compared to the way that the jihadis were operating, has created difficulty over the last 12 months. And I think if you are looking forward at this, when you talk about where our focus is going to be, there's been a danger over the last 12 months that our focus have not been on extremism. I think that is potentially far greater in the years ahead, where the huge resource pressure that every individual country comes under recovery and face multilateral agencies, that actually the level of will as well focus challenged in a way where we absolutely are going to need it to net areas to prevent them once again becoming the kind of to a level of weakness that is that allows an entity such as Daesh to flourish, and even below that, even if you're not getting back to the idea of state creation by extremist counter-terror groups. But on the one of the other main areas that I'm really interested in the review that I'm doing for the government is on disinformation, and Sir John was right, I think, to give the note of skepticism about the rise of the far right. Correct in so much as I think there can really be a tendency to that when colleagues in the Met, when government colleagues, when people say the far right is the fastest growing area, they'll say things which are correct, but what is heard then is actually that this issue is on a parallel with the Islamist threat, which is absolutely demonstrably not the case. And my review is to look at political violence on the far right and the potential for subversions and violence and criminality on the far left as well. And in my new brief is not to look specifically at the ongoing threat of Islamism, but it's really important for me, it will be in the final report that I produce, to make sure that actually that you can anchor that against where the Islamist threat remains, because otherwise I think you can end up skewing the conversation on extremism, end up skewing resources and focus in a way which could be deeply harmful domestically in the coming months and years. But we have had in the States, as Sir John mentioned, an attack, organized violence, criminality within on Capitol Hill in the States, which our intelligence enforcement agencies here are clear would have met the in parts would have met the counter-terror, would have met the terrorism threshold, and that did emanate from a particular far well, it had elements within it of the far right. Now, the thing which one of the things I'm looking at is it is really striking the way in which that largely completely false narrative, which was fueling a lot of, which was fueled what culminated in the January the 6th violence and the storming of the Capitol. I think it is time for us to look again at how that level of disinformation campaign was able to run as virulently as it did, and what, within the complex levers that a liberal democracy like the UK and the US have, what are the levers which are acceptable for a democracy like the UK to pull in similar circumstances, and what's going to be effective. Now, when this time last year, when the pandemic was emerging, there was a lot of speculation of, you know, how disinformation campaigns on the vaccine are going to work. Now, clearly they do exist, but I think one thing that can actually give us a level of optimism, certainly within the UK, is just actually how successful the UK has been in having its population take up the vaccine. And while there is clearly a level of vaccine skepticism within areas of the population, some more than others, and where there are organized campaigns to fuel disinformation over the vaccine, I mean, it is an extraordinary thing that that vaccine take-up has far exceeded any of the official estimates and previous examples, which is a reason to be optimistic about the ability to actually have a level of rational discourse which can be listened to. But Alistair refers to my personal experience of extremism, and I mean, I try to be careful in the language in the way that I talk about this in my experience within the Labour Party before I left it. But I was, while it would be easy and wrong to make glib comparisons between what happened in the US, in Washington, and some of the disinformation tactics of the forces that took over the Labour Party. I'm struck by a poll that was taken while I was still a member of the Labour Party, which suggested that that 50% of Labour Party members at a particular time, when Jeremy Corbyn was its leader, 50% said the only source of news which they trusted was Jeremy Corbyn himself. You know, not The Guardian, not a Labour Party. It was him himself, which I think, I mean, and thankfully the Labour Party has proved me wrong, and is rejecting Corbynism, and it's got much better leader. But it shows actually how vulnerable even mature democracies like our own can be to a level of disinformation, which can quite quickly, I think, shift people's sense of what is acceptable and what it isn't. And I think there is a relationship between the way in which the madness within the Labour Party and the fact that the Labour Party was found to have been acting illegally by the Equality, Commission on Human Rights in regard to its treatment of Jewish members and anti-Semitism. And so so the disinformation space is a really important area where where I think I'm focusing on in the report, and it's going to be important for years to come. Just to conclude on that, I was within, I think, 48 hours of being able to visit Hadea in the Emirates back in March before the restrictions came in, and we decided probably. I mean, I was at the point of booking into the flight, and I'm possible that I would still be there now had I taken a different route. But I think the partnership, I'm hoping to take that back up again as things relax, but the partnership that the UK has with the Emirates in particular on these issues is hugely important now. It's going to be increasingly important in the future. You look at the debate over the PREVENT programme here and the review that we had as just a microcosm of the way in which organised Islamist misinformation and propaganda could really damage the UK's fight against counter-extremism and terrorism going forwards. Thanks, Elsa.
Thanks, John, very much indeed. Thank you for your kind words at the beginning, and thank you for your exposition, and a number of interesting things coming up, some pretty fascinating and different conversations. But I wanted to try and bring them all together by using the first question we've had from our longtime friend, Bashir Bernard Simon, and ask the question about lockdown. And Bashir asks, one of my concerns regarding the growth in extremism under COVID is that lockdown conditions may present fertile grounds for the radicalisation of youth with too much time on their hands online. Is that the case in your view? And if so, how best to counter this threat? And that, I think, goes to disinformation. People with more time to spend with more time on their hands to spend online may be increasingly attracted to those sources of news. And I found the comparison of what Lord Walney was saying about the reliance on Jeremy Corbyn, of course, mirrored very much in the United States, where people's belief in Trump as an individual is outstripping other sources of information, and is quite concerning. The other side to lockdown that some have mentioned, of course, is that because of the circumstances, it does give societies an opportunity for greater surveillance of their people, because you've got to know where people are. Some of the objections to test and trace at the beginning were based around this. There may be some concerns within different parts of not only UK society, but other societies as well. So could we just examine each of you, sort of that lockdown sense? Does it present too much time on people's hands, and therefore they get into, they go to bad places, and that will have been exacerbated during the lockdown? But equally, has it in some ways given societies a better opportunity to find out where people are and maybe disrupt activities? John spoke a little bit about this, so perhaps I could ask the other two to speak first. JJ, do you want to have a crack at that? And then Your Excellency? Muted, John.
There was quite a lot of talk at the beginning of the epidemic about the risks, and you know, if you think back, there were a lot of people talking about conspiracy, theories and all sorts of toxic narratives out there. I mean, it has been striking, I think, as you said, the take-up of the vaccine has been very high in this country. I mean, less so, actually, interestingly, in France for various reasons, in Germany. And that suggests to me that people do actually trust. There is a degree of social trust still in this country, which is worth holding on to. But at the heart of this is this question of trust and of fake news. You talk about the extraordinary approval levels he has, and when he talks about something, when the number of Republicans who believe that the election was stolen is extraordinarily high, simply because Trump says so. And I think that's a reflection of something much broader in society, the way in which we are losing trust in news. You see, and some of this is to do with the way newspaper journalists themselves behave. I mean, they have increasingly become activists rather than reporters, and I think that is seriously dangerous. It's dangerous for all sorts of reasons. I mean, not just because of radicalization or extremism, but because of if trust breaks down, social cohesion breaks down. And for me, that's a long-term trend. What you do about it, I don't know. I simply don't know. It is so powerful out there. But I think that's the longer term. I don't think that's specifically to do with the pandemic or with COVID. It's something that's been happening. It's a storm that's been gathering for years, and it's now here.
Your Excellency, that sense of lockdown given people too much time on their hands to explore the wrong things, but has it enabled societies just to perhaps disrupt illicit activities more than they might have done?
I think, that at least what we can see in the Emirates is that there is a greater capacity for the government to follow us around. We have an app that we have to upload, well, rather, all of our test results for COVID are uploaded, and when we move between Emirates, they need to know there are kind of formal border controls now between certain Emirates. So I think, that's, I don't know for a fact whether state security is using this, but, I assume that there will be some interest. I think just from my own personal experience in lockdown, we have a fairly large house with a garden, and I felt like I was in a pressure cooker, and there was no way of getting away from my family. So I just wonder, less privileged people than I, and how they face lockdown. There's got to be something there. One thing that we have noticed in the Emirates, and that the government again is working very intensively on, is the situation of the mental health of people in lockdown. So not necessarily related to sort of terrorism or extremism, but how people are actually coping with lockdown. So the issue of mental health, as John Jenkins knows, in the Arab world is a very taboo subject, and for the first time, I feel, at least in my lifetime, we're openly talking about the issues of mental health, whether it's depression or anxiety or stress, or even sort of the way in which those mental states then have physical effects, whether it becomes sort of domestic violence or abuse. And so it's fascinating to see the way in which our government and some of our non-government institutions are now beginning to tackle those issues, which I think will have a knock-on effect on situations where people are becoming extremists. We do have very, very stringent laws on what you can say online, and there have been certain cases which have kind of tested the limits of the law, I think. But we are very, very careful that we maintain some kind of social peace online, whether it's on Instagram or social media, Twitter, and so on. And people are very aware of how they describe the world, or how they report on things happening in the Emirates. And there is a big focus on accurate reporting, even if it's in a private capacity. There is a limit to the imagination. You cannot imagine things, and you cannot go out there and start provoking people into believing different things if it's not true. So perhaps there's something there that other countries might want to look at.
Okay, thank you. I want to sort of stay with a religious theme and take a question in relation to that. Sabani White-Spunner, former Lieutenant General Sabani White-Spunner, says to us, a question for Lord Wolney and His Excellency the Minister, and I'll ask John to answer first, if I may. Several politicians have highlighted the need in their constituencies for stronger moderate Islamic guidance in the UK. They say the Muslim Council does not provide this. And recently here we had the interesting experience of the new leader of the Muslim Council for Great Britain being very sharply cross-questioned on Woman's Hour by Emma Barnett, and a very strong reaction to that. But he says, they say the Muslim Council does not provide this, and that both young Muslims and those who teach and mentor them do not have anyone to turn to apply Islam to life in contemporary Britain, unlike other major religions who do. Can the UAE help the UK in suggesting how this might be addressed? So, John Woodcock, what's your experience of this? Is that a fair challenge? And then I'd ask Omar Ghobash, who has a particular interest, particularly in tutoring young Muslims, what he makes of that.
I think it is a really important and difficult issue, and one in which actually I think we have suffered from politicians and others actually finding this too difficult to talk about in the UK for a number of years, and creating something of a vacuum which has allowed a sense that people who have legitimate concerns about the MCB, about other avowedly Islamist organisations operating within the UK have nevertheless not properly articulated why those concerns are, and have allowed others, fueled by those Islamist organisations, to put out a false sense that actually this is just about getting at Muslims. And you have seen that, I think, in the reaction to William Shawcross, as who I think will be an incredibly well qualified reviewer of the Prevent strategy. You are also seeing it in the ongoing debate over the definition of Islamophobia, which is a live issue within government, within local authorities, and actually you have a number of politicians who we could talk about perhaps in another forum, who are generally on the right side of many of these arguments, who feel it's just too difficult, and I don't want to be accused of being against Muslims in general, and therefore I'm going to mute my criticism of organisations who are doing leading things in the wrong direction. But there is not an alternative. It's not for me, for obvious reasons, to say what the alternative should be, or necessarily be part of putting it together. But it is a real problem. We should be more open in talking about it.
Your Excellency, I mean, this the question of moderate Muslim leadership, or however that is defined, is an issue not just in the UK but elsewhere. And Hookie Walker, our former ambassador in the UAE and a great friend of the Emirates Society, follows up the question by linking it to vaccine disinformation, and how some religious leaders have been involved in the effort to try and persuade those who have been reluctant to take vaccines from a religious point of view that actually there's no basis for that. Is that an issue you see in other parts of the world? And is this an unfair criticism of Islamic teaching, or does it still have a very strong basis?
Yeah, complicated question. I think the way in which we approach religion and life in the Emirates is quite different from the way in which the question kind of presents it. We having very, very strong secular kind of leadership, by which I mean the leadership of the ruling family, the crown prince, the prime minister of the Emirates, the ruler of Dubai. They have such a powerful presence in people's lives that it becomes very, very difficult to listen to self-appointed Muslim spokespeople who want to push a certain agenda. And so we're living in a society where we've got leadership with the ability to make change, with the ability to present a positive view of life, and an ability to actually provide these opportunities and to empower people. That we, in fact, these extremist voices are kind of drowned out in a wealth of opportunity and a wealth of challenges in the world in which we live. We do also know that we can directly intervene in the way in which our religious leaders are trained, and that those are choices that we as a society can make. Often we're in the past, at least, we're always, we were given the impression that a Muslim spokesman represents what is called true Islam, and that there is this idea that true Islam exists somewhere and he's the one who can define it for us. What we noticed also was that often these people are making it up as they go along anyway. And they are using this position of authority, self-appointed authority or self-granted authority, to make decisions for people. as long as people are going to start, as long as young people are going to be looking for that kind of guidance, we run the risk of having them fall into those narratives. And again, I say we, with our secular leadership, we're able to push back against that current or those currents and those people. And we provide a broader set of opportunities for people to do other things. I'm not sure that we would have much to advise British Muslims on, other than the example that we give. There's no specific guidance on how to live in the modern world, other than to live in the modern world and get on with things.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly, Alistair, that I think the example and the leadership that the UAE has been showing on this, and particularly through the Forum for Promoting Peace, which I've had the privilege of now, bringing together faith in involving the Anglican Church here. It makes a real difference on this, and we should maybe think of ways in which we can reflect that into the UK to an even greater level.
Thanks, JJ.
Very quickly, I mean, this is a debate that's particularly heated in France at the moment, of course, with President Macron's proposals for various things, including a charter. He's trying to get imams in France and their representative organizations to sign up to this charter endorsing the public knowledge. And there's been a lot of talk in France about having imams who promote a European Islam or whatever you want to call it. There's something that's happening in Austria as well with the Chancellor Kurz. I do think that gets it the wrong way around. I mean, one of the ways in which extremist voices are empowered because non-extreme voices are shut down, and you see it. I was reading a very good piece actually this morning in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung from a Moroccan Swiss writer, Qasim al-Ghazali, about this very subject, and you see, I mean, there is this extraordinary and weird alliance with some on the left, between Islamists and some on the left, to intimidate and shut down progressive voices. The key is to enable those voices to be heard more clearly, and that function of open debate. I think one of the things that we have witnessed in the West, in particular in recent years, is this closing down of debate. That's the unhealthy thing.
Perhaps I can pick up on that and just broaden the debate away from the pure concentration on Islamic issues by picking up Jim White's question, the great Jim White. And he says this: do you agree that we can learn from history when combating false news? People don't change, but technology does. When cheap printing presses became available, there was an explosion in destabilizing radical political pamphlets. The situation was brought under control by deeming the printers to be publishers, with penalties for printing false news. Should social media platforms be treated the same way? Now, a big debate goes on about that, but is that one way forward? And would that restriction help or hinder? JJ, do you want to start on that, and then I'll ask other colleagues?
I mean, that's a huge question. I mean, I speak as a Catholic, so you can't expect me to welcome the turmoil which the introduction of printing into Western Europe and the production of inflammatory.
Doesn't it mean you're always right, JJ?
And, yes, it does. And only when I'm speaking ex cathedra. The explosion of inflammatory Protestant pamphlets caused. But you look at the European 17th century. It was the most violent century in the history of modern Europe. It's a social issue, really, and it's social. I think there are things you can do with social media companies and the rest of it, because they are publishers basically, even though they deny they're not. But it's I just wonder whether it's gone too far, because it's not just social media. You also see it in the way that universities conduct research these days, in the way that newspapers operate, and so forth. I mean, I don't know what to do about that, but it is a huge problem.
Your Excellency and John, a view on whether we physically tighten the controls on social media to make it more difficult for them, or to give them greater responsibility for what is put out there? Your Excellency?
I was going to hand over the opportunity to answer that question to Lord Wolney.
Very wise. I think we should be watching really closely. I'm trying to watch closely what's happening in Australia on this, where I think there is a particular focus in Australia on the way in which a potentially hostile, certainly non-aligned state has ability to pump disinformation into Australian culture via currently totally unregulated means. Jim is right to put the question in the way he does, and when you spend time with military colleagues, they find this sort of audible eye rolling at the suggestion that the idea of disinformation is in any way new. But where I think it is a threat on a new scale, and that it is so much more of a challenge now to regulate the kind of information which people can access. Yes, the publisher issue is hugely important, but even if you took even if you made social media companies publishers, that's only actually relatively one small part of the forest, and where within the information was largely channeled through things like printing presses. Now, I don't think you can put back in the box the extraordinary explosion of people's ability to get news, or certainly we would not want to in a liberal democratic society, and so it raises the game in a way which makes it much more of a challenge.
Excellency, did you want to comment, or we've got one more question? You can come in on that, perhaps.
I'll
all right,
the next
okay.
Question.
We have one. I have one final question before I ask His Excellency the Ambassador to round us off with a vote of thanks. It's a question from Zeshan Zafar, and I just want to broaden it a little. It's about the theory of grievance, and Zeshan says this. You could argue that Islamism has evolved in the past 5 years, one that converges far left thought, decolonial critical Muslim studies, and finally activists from the social justice community. The theory of grievance has become an enticing approach for many young impressionable Muslims in the West. Is this an area that policy circles and governments are taking note of? And I would add to that, the theory of grievance that is elsewhere. We saw it in the demonstrations in the United States, people believing that something had been taken from them. There is an interesting new film being premiered at the Berlin Film Festival this week, Je suis Karl, which is looking at the far right in Europe, using, again, as Sir John has said, that sense of cancelling, and using the ability to close down people, to put long-term people of far right views in places in establishment in order not to use people with short cropped hair and violence, but to take over society in a different way, using disinformation and the like. And that theory of grievance, which is fed upon in so many different ways. So the theory of grievance, both in Muslim communities and wider communities, as a last comment from each of you, do you have a view as to whether various societies are now very, very much more susceptible to a sense that if something has gone wrong, it's somebody else's fault, and their governments won't do anything about it, but some external force can? Sir John, first of all, and then Your Excellency, and then Lord Wolney.
Yeah, it's toxic. One of the problems with this, because the grievance Olympics fit into a sort of a wide, as the questioner said, it's wider question of the issue of post-colonialism, subaltern studies, critical. And the problem with all of this is that there is no way to change. There is no theory of change. I mean, which makes it a cult rather than politics. It makes it faith rather than politics. I mean, you know, like Roma D'Angelo's stuff about, you know, white fragility and the rest of it, you are inevitably racist if you're white, whatever white means. And you can never change, you can never get better, you can only confess. I mean, that is not the basis for any sensible politics that I recognize. It's the politics of the iconoclasts in 7th century, 8th century Byzantium. It's the politics of the idol smashers in 16th and 17th century Europe. It's a politics of every cult that has ever existed. But now, because of social media, it has penetrated our societies to a degree that it never did in the past. You know, when the Anabaptists of Munster took that city over in the 1640s, I mean, they were crushed because they were isolated. I think too many people now, and you see this also with the far right. You see it with QAnon, incel people, Proud Boys, and so forth. And you know, it's part of this decay of trust, of social trust that we were talking about earlier. That's a generational challenge.
Yeah, Your Excellency.
You know, when I heard the idea of grievance, it made me think of our Prime Minister, the ruler of Dubai, who about 15 years ago, he doesn't often make these public statements, and he doesn't often address other countries or other Arab leaders. His focus is very much, you know, the internal development of the country. But he made a very famous kind of speech where he said to other leaders in the Arab world, if you don't listen to your people, if you don't hear what they're saying, and if you don't respond positively to what they're saying, you're gonna end up in a very bad situation. And then a few years later, we saw the Arab Spring, and we saw the pushback against the Arab Spring. And he understood a long time ago that people have needs, people have aspirations. And so in that sense, I think we in the Emirates are in an incredibly lucky place, because we don't have, we have an understanding of grievance and justified grievance, and then we have an understanding that government and society can actually do something to change that situation. And it really feels that we're very, very privileged in that sense, that we have a government that actively engages with its people, actively listens to particularly young people. And you know, so in that context, a few years ago, we established a ministry for youth, led by a very young minister, who's I think now is about 26 or 27 years old. And there's a continual dialogue going on between government and young people. And a lot of things are actually being led by younger people these days. So I think that sense of hope, that sense of opportunity, again, I'm sorry I keep coming back to that, but that's really what I'm getting out of all of this. And it gives me a great deal of pride to be able to say that.
Great, thank you. Lorani.
Zeshan puts the question superbly, how to respond. What Sir John and His Excellency the Minister talk about, the erosion of trust, is indeed the foundation of this. And you look at the really spectacular fall in trust in a myriad of institutions, in going over decades, but also actually in the last 10 years, including very much and very importantly in government, in political institutions, in politicians themselves. It's spectacular. It's hugely erosive, corrosive, and it is exactly the environment in which other things fill, like the grievance narrative, which Zeshan maps running right the way along what are otherwise contradictory threads. There is obviously no easy answer, but I think one thing, you know, this is not a government. I would have many disagreements with this government, as Alistair would know, because he had to listen to me moaning on about a lot of them when he was a minister. But where I think actually they should be commended is in saying that actually there needs to be a space for challenge of the grievance culture, and actually creating a framework for debate, and to be able to say that the new orthodoxies that have been pushed in a number of critically important spheres of public life and debate have actually come out of not come out of nowhere, but they have become unassailable totems within the space sometimes of weeks, you know, certainly years, and then actually, and that should not allow us to, should not accept the idea that all debate about them is no longer valid. And I think we are in danger of slipping into that place. And unless we have got actually the space to talk about this, you don't tackle the erosion of trust and grievance culture by accepting a particular grievance narrative. You have to have the space as a country to be able to debate and challenge it. That's what traditionally the UK has been at its strongest, and it's where we should aim to be in the future.
Thank you very much. Wise words, both of warning, but also some looking ahead, and indeed, as far as I was concerned, some answers to some of the challenges that are there that we can already see and should promote. Could I now ask His Excellency, the Ambassador of the UAE to the UK, to offer a vote of thanks to our three distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Alistair, for another superb Emirates Society event. It's a very salutary warning against the risks of complacency. For the past year, we may have been distracted by R rates, vaccines, and lockdowns, but extremism is also a type of infection that ruins lives wherever it goes. And it's not just the victims of extremist violence that we should remember, it's also the young minds that have the poison, that are poisoned by very dangerous ideologies. So I'm really pleased about the work the UAE and the UK are doing together in this area. And I'm very grateful for all that His Excellency Omar Ghobash does, and Sir John Jenkins and Lord Walney, in the quality of outstanding people we have and the time they dedicate. They devote a great deal of their time to thinking deeply about these issues and working out what can be done to keep our people safe. Gentlemen, it's been an absolutely fascinating and deeply reassuring 60 minutes. And on behalf of the Emirates Society, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador, and thank you very much to colleagues. I'm delighted to say that we record these and make these available to Emirates Society members, so it will have, I would imagine, quite a wide distribution when people hear the quality and the excellence of the comments that we've heard. So, Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. Can I thank not only our panelists, but all those who have attended, some very high-quality colleagues, and say a very warm good afternoon to you all, and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.